right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this, the first Oxford Psychedelic Society event of Trinity Term. Like everyone else, we've had to do things a bit differently, what with the lockdown, but that's as much an opportunity as it is a problem to be solved. So whereas usually we just bring one speaker up to Oxford for our speaker event, this week we're fortunate enough to be joined by three separate speakers who research psychedelics with three approaches that are significantly different to what is often the focus of our speaker events. So there's much to be said for talk of neural mechanisms, for placebo-controlled trials, but these far from exhaust the ways that we can come to know about psychedelics. With that spirit of doing things differently in mind, we decided to start off talking about ayahuasca, the shamanic group from the Upper Amazon, because to my mind at least, this more than any other psychedelic resists the normal way of thinking about these things. Before I pass over to our first speaker, Kerry Rowberry, I thought for the benefit of everyone that isn't familiar with ayahuasca, I'd just go through a quick primer. And for people that already know their stuff, I promise it won't be too long. So to introduce ayahuasca, it's probably best to do a bit of compare and contrast with psilocybin, which is the current darling of psychedelic science. So both psilocybin mushrooms and ayahuasca have come to the West via sacramental traditions in Latin America. Psilocybin mushrooms through Maria Sabina and George Wason. Psilocybin was co-opted fairly quickly into Western psychedelia. It was Albert Hofmann who isolated psilocybin molecule in the late 50s and started synthesizing it and marketing it as indocybin at the start of the 60s. I will gloss over how ayahuasca came here because that's the focus of Kerry's talk. With apologies to any pharmacologists or neuroscientists, this is a vast simplification, but psilocybin and ayahuasca operate largely the same in the brain. As you'll see in the bottom right-hand corner, DMT, which is the main psychoactive component of ayahuasca, and psilocin, which is the active metabolite of psilocybin, look bang on the same as serotonin there. And the larger chunk of their activity is based on serotonin receptors in the brain, chiefly among those 5-HT1A, 5-HT2C, and of course 5-HT2A, which is where most, but by no means all of the magic happens. In terms of what's going on in the brain, when you take ayahuasca or you take mushrooms, the principle is very much the same. You find really radical changes in how information is processed in the brain and how it's passed from one brain region to the other. In different ways, ayahuasca and psilocybin will disrupt the functioning of the default mode network, part of the brain which does a whole host of stuff but is implicated in self-referential processing, narrative processing. But when this is disrupted, that phenomenon seems to co-vary with mystical experiences. So with psilocybin, same with ayahuasca, if you take a large enough dose of one of these drugs, fairly reliably you'll have a mystical experience. The same sort of mystical experience that you traditionally get through more conventional means like extended periods of fasting or prayer or meditation. And like psilocybin, ayahuasca, the early signals are saying that this is potentially a really promising treatment for depression and addiction. The reason why ayahuasca hasn't had anything near the attention from clinical science as psilocybin has, chiefly down to two factors. One of which is that with ayahuasca, before you get any interesting psychedelic effects, you have what's affectionately known as the purge. So you'll have a period of quite strong transient nausea, which tends to lead towards physical purging, either by vomiting or through diarrhea, or if you're unlucky, both at the same time. And that isn't very attractive in terms of developing into a medicine. More crucially is the fact that Western clinical science likes to operate on a model of something like one molecule to one receptor or one receptor class. You just assume that a drug operates on one receptor, and so you'll just produce a drug with one molecule, and you can standardize the production of that drug, and you know that every single dose is the same as the last. And that is just not how ayahuasca works at all. So the bottom left is a jug of this ayahuasca brew, this tea, and every single time you make a shaman makes ayahuasca, it's different. So there are about a dozen plants in the Amazon that regularly go into ayahuasca brews. Far too many for me to go into too much detail here, so I'll just point out the most important ones. Crucially, you need a source of DMT down there in the bottom left. DMT sources abound all over in nature. You can find it in a lot of citrus peels. You can find it in quite a lot of ornamental grasses of the kind you find in Europe and North America. Within the upper Amazon, ayahuasca brews typically use with the chacruna leaf, most commonly, Psychotria viridis, and in Ecuador, the chupanga leaf or vine. Even though these plant sources are both very high in DMT, and DMT itself is incredibly hallucinogenic, you could munch on these leaves all day long without experiencing anything of a high. You'd have more hope getting drunk just by eating chocolate liqueurs. The reason for that is that DMT, when it's taken orally, is broken down in the gut by a few enzymes, monoamine oxidases, and that's where ayahuasca, the vine, comes in. So the drink ayahuasca takes its name from this vine, the capi vine, which, when it's appropriately prepared, releases a whole host of monoamine oxidase inhibitors, principally three: harmine, harmaline, and tetrahydroharmine. When ethnobotanists first isolated harmine, they named it telepathy, because they put a lot of stock by reports that ayahuasca improves telepathic abilities. It wasn't until about 10 years later that the penny dropped and people realized, oh, actually we've already discovered this and it already has a name, it's harmine. These three compounds, these monoamine oxidase inhibitors, are structurally very similar to drugs that are already used in Western psychiatric practice. Monoamine oxidase inhibitors used to be a very popular treatment for depression, and they're no longer first-line treatments for depression, but if SSRIs don't work, or if you have mixed anxiety with depression or atypical depression, it's not uncommon to prescribe one of these MRes. Before going on, so in 2017, the Beckley Foundation, a private research organisation just outside of Oxford, published a study on harmine and harmaline, where they found in vitro these compounds can encourage adult neurogenesis. That is to say, they can make new adult brain growth, which up until about 15 years ago, we didn't even think was possible. For me, the most interesting aspect of ayahuasca is this lady, Madre Ayahuasca, the Queen of the Forest, or Mother Ayahuasca. So very commonly reported among people that we use ayahuasca is a sense of being in communion with a divine entity of some sort. And among these people, there's a high preponderance of agreement about what the nature of this entity is, about what this Madre Ayahuasca, who's understood to be the spirit of the ayahuasca vine, is like. So as well as being maternal or grandmaternal, she cares very much for you. So the tables that I've put up here are from a very interesting and very readable study of Johns Hopkins, which sent out a survey to a good few thousand people who had what are described as subjective God encounter experiences. So all the respondents of this study, either as a result of taking a psychedelic drug or through more conventional means, fasting, prayer, meditation, or just spontaneously, had a mystical experience that was characterized by meeting God or some sort of emissary of the divine. In the right-hand column here, you'll see the figures for the ayahuasca group, who I assume many of, I can't be sure that it was all of them, are reporting on one of these experiences of meeting Mother Ayahuasca. So there's high agreement that this entity is both benevolent and intelligent, i.e. She wants what's best for you, and also she seems to know things about you. So additionally to this, after people have had this experience and sobered up and the entity is gone, 3/4 of people will adamantly maintain that whatever it was they experienced actually was real. It wasn't just some strange fluke of chemistry or the fact that they were tripping on DMT. People insist that this was something that was real and exists in some sort of dimension, some other dimension. Typically though, if you probe people who've had one of these experiences to justify why they believe that, the reasons they give, if they do give reasons, aren't very compelling at all. But this is par for the course with mystical experiences, because two factors that are central to mystical experiences, firstly, are ineffability, i.e. the sense that whatever it was that was experienced can't be explained normally in language. And likewise, this noetic quality is the sense that when you learn something, you learn it immediately or imminently. There is no way that you have to go around discursive logic or the usual ways that you come to understand anything in the world. Of particular interest to, I guess, Western users of psychedelics is the fact that these encounters with Mother Ayahuasca often come with some sense of information being exchanged, or Mother Ayahuasca will leave you with some sort of message or a mission or an insight for you to take home. Users will jokingly refer to this as their homework, some psychospiritual or self-growth or relational things that they need to do or reflect on. And often people won't go back and take another ayahuasca ceremony until they've made some headway on this homework. So I think these sorts of experiences are important, whatever your metaphysical commitments are. So say if you are a completely hard-nosed materialist, and you think that this sense of ineffability, this sense of noesis, of just knowing something immediately, if it may be at the end of the day, these are just neurological phenomena. It may be that if you tickle the right part in the brain in the right way, you have a sense of noesis, you have a sense of ineffability. But even if that is true, we are a long, long way from understanding in neurochemical or neuromechanic terms what's going on with these experiences. And in the meantime, people's lives are being hugely changed, and changed for the better because of them. So after one of these encounter experiences, there's high degrees of agreement that people's lives have improved in all sorts of ways. They feel better with their life, they feel it has more meaning, more purpose. People will start meditating or praying more. Of particular interest is the fact that it decreases fear of death. So last month, I co-wrote with our second speaker, Sam Gandy, who I see has just appeared on screen there, a piece arguing for the use of psychedelics in palliative care. And this is one of the best replicated, strongest evidence streams we have for psychedelics, which is that a psychedelic experience can make you less afraid of dying, which is great for palliative care, but also more generally as a society. We don't have a good relationship with death. We tend to consider it a medical problem that needs to be solved rather than just a natural part of life that it is. In the bottom table there, the most controversially at all, these encounters with Mother Ayahuasca or a similar entity are interesting because they cure atheism. They cure atheism phenomenally well, in fact. 3/4 of the people that go into one of these experiences identifying as atheist reject that label afterwards. And again, even if you don't want to entertain any shifty or metaphysics on account of these, it really makes a difference. Like the society that you live is in some part driven by the kinds of beliefs about the afterlife, about religion, about spirituality that its population holds. If any of that has piqued your curiosity and you're not averse to thinking in unorthodox ways, I highly recommend this book, DMT, The Spirit Molecule by Rick Strassman. So well before Imperial were testing psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression, well before Roland Griffiths and everyone at JHU was exploring these mystical events with psilocybin. Between 1990 and 1995, Rick Strassman at the University of New Mexico was cheerfully dosing volunteers up with DMT to see what would happen, and this book is one of the main outputs from that research. Simply put, his thesis is that DMT, which is produced endogenously in the brain, primarily serves to smooth the passage of the soul into and out of this world, i.e. that being born and dying are the great cosmic psychedelic experiences that we all go through, and DMT smooths that way. There is something to be said to this, to consider it. As you probably know, the pineal gland is held in significant spiritual reverence in a lot of cultures. I know the ancient Egyptians considered it the eye of Horus, and New Age types like to refer to it as the third eye. And maddeningly, it is in some sense a third eye. So this gland that's buried deep beneath your skull in the dark is nonetheless sensitive to light levels in the same way that your eye is. And if anyone in the audience has gone through first year philosophy at Oxford, you'll know this has some bearing on Western history as well. This is where Descartes thought the causal nexus between the soul and the body took place. For what it's worth, I don't buy this story, not quite yet. It's a kind of compelling, beautiful little narrative, which makes me more cautious. Primarily going against it is the fact that even though DMT is produced in mammalian pineal glands, the amount of DMT that you need to have a trip, if you're endogenously producing it from your own brain, is about 1,000 times as much as the DMT produces over the course of one day. However, our speaker in week 6, Chris Timmerman, has done a lot of interesting work on DMT states from a neuroscientific perspective. And it does so happen that one of the more interesting findings of his was that DMT states and near-death experiences are phenomenally similar in terms of how they're experienced. So I am willing to be convinced on that. That's enough from me. I will pass over to Kerry in a couple of moments. Before that, while this is free and we're very happy that you're here, it would mean a lot to us if you could sling a quid or two our way to support running costs. We would like in the next few events to add some more bells and whistles, and someone from the society will add a PayPal link in the chat. After each speaker, we'll pause for questions. If you want to ask a question, feel free to type it in the chat window, and when the speaker's done, I will unmute you so you can ask it yourself. All right, thank you. Kerry Rowberry is a PhD student at the University of Cumbria, and her research focuses on curandeirism, that is the main healing tradition of the Upper Amazon that uses ayahuasca, insofar as it exists in the UK. Kerry.
Thank you. Hi. Excuse me. Let's get my slides up. Okay. Oh. There we go. Can we see that? Can you see my slides?
I can't yet.
Not yet.
No. Okay. Sorry about that. Let's try again.
Ray, might this need a shift of hosting response?
Aha, there we go. We got it?
Yep, gotcha.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. There we go. Fantastic. Thank you so much for that introduction. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about a chapter from my PhD where I kind of wanted to look at how did we become aware of ayahuasca in the UK, in the Occident world. So what I did is I looked through all the research I could, all the popular literature I could find, all popular media, films, music, newspapers, and just try to piece everything together and see how that might have, how these occurrences in how these reports of ayahuasca might have also had a bearing on our attitude towards it, and you know, how we might approach it. So this is the culmination of that work. It's I've truncated it quite a lot. This is a bit of a timeline, really, and here are the categories that I broke it down into, and mainly just to kind of the category, the date ranges were mainly just to kind of have a kind of almost equal amount of things to write about in each section. So we go for, you know, the first one's 100 years, you know, and then we go from the 60s to just into the 90s, the zeros, and then in 2010 and beyond. And I kind of felt after about 2015, I started feeling like I'd reached saturation. It was abundantly clear that people knew about this now. You know, when I started my PhD quite a while ago now, in the end of 2011, you know, people who are interested in psychedelics were, you know, kind of knew what I was talking about. But you know, if I met someone random, someone's aunt or something like that, they wouldn't have had a clue. But you know, more recently, I think, you know, I've been quite surprised at how many people are actually aware of what ayahuasca is and have some sense of general understanding of it. So so I kind of decided to cut it off around about 2015, although I did get some statistical, like numerical data up until the end of 2019. So so we start with there was a little bit of contest between who was the first academic to, you know, to go in, you know, into the Amazon and investigate and to, you know, to bring that out to us in the Occidental world, and that was between Richard Spruce and Manuel Villavicencio. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. But Spruce first visited the Amazon in 1851. He didn't publish for a while, and when he did, he actually classified the Banisteriopsis capi vine as Banisteria capi, but that later got changed. But so basically the first peer-reviewed account that came out was credited to the Ecuadorian geographer Villavicencio. And that was 1958, which was before Spruce's first peer-reviewed piece, but Spruce did actually beat him to the post in terms of publishing through the Hooker's Journal of Botany there about 4 years earlier. So I think they can kind of share the title in a sense of who kind of brought it out to us. So originally, so the first part of this, in terms of academic papers and academic work, the first part of this presentation is actually based on McKenna, Calloway and Grubb's paper that they published in 1998, and they did quite a thorough review, part of the Ayahuasca project, of all the previous scientific research that had gone before. So I used that as a foundation for this, and then kind of continued it on and expanded it in terms of bringing in popular literature and media and things like that. So McKenna tells us that in the early days there was some taxonomic confusions. It was quite slow, research was quite slow, and the research was predominantly inaccessible outside of the specific fields of chemistry and botany. But we actually saw the first media appearance in 1932, and this really surprised me when I stumbled across it, simply because it's in a magazine called Modern Mechanics, and that was a little bit of a surprise that it would be in a magazine about mechanics, and there it is in the corner, just 43 words on yage, which is one of the local terms for the brew, and they said in there that the drug is supposed to cause clairvoyance. So that was my sweet little find, the first little popular media appearance. But then we go on to you know, the famous Burroughs and Ginsberg yage letters. That's, you know, one of the kind of earliest. So it was being talked about, and it was being talked about in very specific circles as well. So these are you know, part of the beats generation. There's a sense of hedonism with them. They're experimental, you know, in terms of drug use, but also they're literati. They're, you know, they're well educated, and you know, there's a you know, sense of class behind them as well. So that you know, that would have been really our kind of first introduction to them, and then over the 60s, very little academic research, just one peer review paper looking specifically at the Hamala alkaloids at that time, and then we, you know, throughout the 70s, late 60s, 70s, we're actually in terms of psychedelic research and culture, very much sidetracked by LSD and the kind of movement and politics and everything that surrounded that. And we kind of wasn't thinking about ayahuasca at that time, and there were lots of other things going on. So but there were 19 peer-reviewed papers in the 70s that they offered insight into the different individual communities within the Amazon and how they approached ayahuasca rituals differently, and it also, their work sets out that the standard ingredients are Banisteriopsis caapi and Psychotria viridis, but they do list quite a substantive table of admixtures that are also used as well. So that's a very interesting source of information. Then we come on to the McKenna brothers, and both Dennis and Terence, and their the publication of their first book, providing details of their ayahuasca experiences with the Javiero community. So that would have, you know, I'm not quite sure of the popularity that would have had when it was first released and the impact that would have had, but it's certainly come to be, you know, the McKenna brothers have certainly come to be, you know, well-known names associated with the subject and sources to go to. So then we go into the 80s, and we saw quite a peak of interest, but we were mainly focused on the biochemical aspects of ayahuasca. Yet we did start to also move into looking at the subject from a psychological perspective with the works of Fishman and Whale. But it's still it's not really established itself as a field at that time. So we get our man Paul Simon and his album Rhythm of the Saints. So this is the first musician really bringing it now to an audience, a very particular audience. You know, he's got a very particular kind of middle class following that, you know, that are kind of more discerning in their tastes. He's not necessarily pop, but certainly one of his songs, Spirit Voices, does hint towards the fact that it is about drinking ayahuasca, although he doesn't really talk about it much other than that. Then Bayer tells us that ayahuasca reached popular Occidental awareness in 1991, mainly through the works of the publication of the book Ayahuasca Visions, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar of, the paintings of Pablo Amaringo, and, you know, they're very, very popular. The ayahuasquero painting, his depictions of his visions. So Bayer seems to think that was quite significant in kind of building the awareness, and that came out in 91. And then we've got so Grunwell, he I believe sorry, I should have written that down, was writing for the Independent or Times, was saying that the most influential books of the last decade, so that he's published, he said that in 98, in relation to the growing popularity of ayahuasca, were likely those of Terence McKenna, specifically the Food of the Gods, Archaic Revival, and True Hallucinations. So McKenna obviously doing a lot to bring it to the public knowledge. And there's obviously one of the paintings of Pablo Amalingo there. There we go. So then we get our first lady pop artist as well, Tori Amos. So this was a bit weird. I stumbled across this as various fan sites and a biography of Tori Amos that claim that she took part in an interview, and they published the transcript as well, for Nouveau magazine in 1994, promoting her album In the Pink. And in the interview promoting the album, she discusses her use of ayahuasca. However, I tried to find the original source and actually contacted what I believe is the only Nouveau magazine I could find, and they're based in Canada. However, they didn't actually start publishing until 1997. So there's a bit of something's not quite right in there, but certainly the album was 1894. There doesn't seem any reason for any of these people to be misquoting her, or it's the transcript is there, but unfortunately it doesn't, unless there was another Nouveau magazine at that time that I've not been able to come across. So we move on to Sting. We've recently seen him in the psychedelic documentary that's just come out on Netflix. So he was in the Rolling Stones magazine in 98 talking about ayahuasca, but he didn't actually call it ayahuasca, he called it dead man's root. And I must be honest, in all my time reading about ayahuasca, this is the only time I've ever heard of it referred to as dead man's root. To my knowledge, that we know that neither Chacruna or Banisteriopsis capi are a root, and whether any of the admixtures that can be applied are that's potential, and whether the version that he drank had that, then there's a potential there. But so if we took that article alone, we could have had some cast some doubt on whether or not he was talking about ayahuasca. But we see later that he certainly was. So again, he's bringing it out to a particular audience, same as Tori Amos, certainly music fans, and then we have Rick Strassman, legend in the 90s, who spent many years campaigning to lift the ban on researching psychedelics, which he was successful at doing, thank God. That's why we're all here now. And that led to his first publication on the subject in 94. Co-authored paper looked at dose responses of N,N-dimethyltryptamine in humans. So not particularly specifically about ayahuasca, but we're getting there, and as we've seen, it does lead on to the larger work later. So McKenna continued his work and he was part of setting up the Ayahuasca project, assisted by funding from MAPS, together with Charles Grob and others. Between 92 and 95, they were able to research enough to produce 8 papers that primarily focused on neuropharmacological aspects of ayahuasca, but also provided the review that was the foundation for this bit of research that I've done here. Okay, so I've got a little graph here. So that's the graph taken from the McKenna, Callaway and Grob paper. They finished in 98, so there's a little bit of data missing there at the end, but I was able to find a further 11 papers. So you see there's that, very slow to start, but a little gradual incline of interest academically, still in quite specific fields at that time. And still quite a few, just a select number of researchers. Another book that has been very popular, that could be cited as an influence of the spread of knowledge of ayahuasca, is Jeremy Narby's Cosmic Serpent in 98, which showed his field work with the Ashanka people, and I must admit, I think it's a great piece of work until you get to about the last quarter, and then my eyebrows started to twitch a little bit. But definitely very popular piece of work. And then we had, so these are little things that happen in the news. It would have been in the news, and or at least, you know, kind of important to what's been going on. We see that in 1999 there was a failed attempt to put a patent on the Banisteriopsis capivine. And that was based on the fact that publications describing the plant were known and available prior to filing the patent applications. It's a bit not sure, a bit dubious to be patenting plants, well, pre-genetic modification days, I guess. And then we get when we start seeing it appear in the news, so we use Lexis Library news article database to get this data. And I found the first mention of ayahuasca was in 1990 in the Independent, and it was raised pretty much in passing in a review of a biography about Ginsberg. But we also saw later that few journalists started reporting on their own experiences with it, and the articles that were occurring in the 90s were looking at, you know, they were actually educating about the associated regions and things like that. There wasn't any kind of fear, oh, look at this cult scary new psychedelic. It was actually quite balanced and reasonable reporting. We can see, again, it wasn't glamorized though. This gentleman, Peter Carty, he was, you know, he said, as for myself, it's 4.5 hours lying on the floor, and you know, the drug lingered. He suffered flashbacks. He's not glamorizing it, but I think that there were, you know, from what I read, quite fair and balanced. So here are all the news articles published in the 90s. Statistically, we can see that the majority are coming from the Guardian, that's the light blue, then you've got Independent in pink, and the Times and the Sunday Times there in the darker colour. You know, it's quite mixed. There's peaks and troughs here and there. No explanation as to why there were no articles in 1995, but I do look a little bit deeper in the chapter into some of these spikes and exploring why there were particular spikes at that time. So onto the 2000s, we start getting real significant academic interest at this time. We got the first 2 conferences dedicated to ayahuasca. The first co-organised by Ralph Metzner, titled Ayahuasca Conference in March 2000. And then we've got the screen just actually, the screen where I can see you guys is actually covering up the last part of my slide. So but Psychoactivity 3 was hosting in Amsterdam a couple of years later. So, you know, we're really starting to see grow as a field now in the early 2000s. And then Strassman's book that we've already seen come out, again, really reaching a quite a wide audience, quite a commercial audience with that work, and even more so with the subsequent documentary with Joe Rogan. We saw in 2007 that, you know, there was legitimation when the Santodyne won the court, won the court battle to allow members to continue the ceremonial usage of ayahuasca as a constitutional and human right to freedom of religion. We do also know that since that, I think a couple of years ago, that's since sadly been overturned. It's no longer the case, but at that time it would have added to the, you know, the sense that this is something that we can safely, or, you know, this is something of interest that we can explore. Sting comes back in 2003 with his memoir, where he does actually go in depth about the ayahuasca experience. So just validating the aforementioned claim there. Lots of speculation on fan sites and things suggesting Alex Gray and Tor were both influenced by ayahuasca. And, you know, largely they have had some, well, Alex Gray has painted some paintings, you know, based on his ayahuasca experience, but they're in style far different from actually, you know, his main body of work, which were actually, when we go and have a read of his autobiography, were actually influenced by LSD. And then it was very difficult to find any kind of evidence about Tor or any members of Tor lots of reference to peyote and things like that, but not specifically ayahuasca. So quite a big film, Blueberry, aka Renegade, came out in 2004, and that was ayahuasca's first appearance on the big screen, on silver screen, and you had about 30 minutes of depicting a quite interesting, colourful, in part scary, and ayahuasca experience in that movie. So we're reaching more and more people with this subject, as every year goes on at this point. We get the Other Worlds documentary come out, 90-minute piece, featuring Pablo Amaringo, Callaway as well, of the Ayahuasca Project. So it's getting in, and there's obviously one of Alex Gray's pieces there for you. 2004 we had Benny Shannon's Tomb, Antipodes of the Mind. This was quite a significant piece of work, based on thousands of ayahuasca experiences and trying to chart them topologically, and it's a fantastic read, and a very good resource to go. So that's kind of, I wouldn't say necessarily reaching the mass populace, but definitely moving it along academically, away from the botanical and kind of chemical aspects of it. So then we see ayahuasca tourism is reported to have kicked off around 2001. In his 2009 book, Your Country on Drugs, The Secrets of Getting High, Grimm tells us, he reports a conversation that he had with a Peruvian shaman he met in New York, who's saying, before 2001, they never saw any Americans, but in Peru by 2005, the ayahuasca tourism was quite significant at that point. We see enter terrestrial TV in Britain in 2005, Channel 4's Extreme Celebrity Detox. And also Bruce Perry's Tribe, that came on BBC One, both featuring ayahuasca. So that was really in the UK our first kind of, everybody's in everybody's world now. That we weren't so much on Netflix and things at that time. In 2005. Where are we? So then we get Sacred Vine of the Spirits, Ralph Metzer's combined collection of papers that he put together about the more religious aspects and spiritual aspects of it, I suppose. And the UDV court victory, again quite significant in America that time, and again, just like Netherlands, it was said that the UDV could practice in their particular religious setting and use it without fear of prosecution. So then real mainstream Weeds, black comedy Weeds had an episode that featured the lead character Nancy having a visual experience with ayahuasca. Again, it wasn't particularly portrayed as a glamorous thing to do. She was throwing up, it was all there, it was quite grim and worrying. So I think people have had this sense of caution about it all along, really. And then we also saw it, another documentary, Heaven Earth, come out at that time. We saw it in Nip Tuck a year later, another black comedy, one of their episodes. It was featured and discussed, and although not about ayahuasca, I think it's worth mentioning Gaspar Noé's Enter the Void about DMT, because they're inextricably linked subjects, and that has received quite a large audience and kind of cult status as a movie. So here we go. Here's all the newspaper articles published in that year, in that decade. A lot more range from a political perspective of who's covering it at this time. A lot more in terms of how many articles were featured, and I did go through them all. I wasn't just going how many articles are tagged with ayahuasca or how many articles just got one word. I looked for something significant featured in the article relating to it, and that's what I came up with. Okay, where we got, so going to 2010, so I'm going to try and get a bit quicker now. 2010s, he's there, we've got it, rock bands are using it and promoting it in NME. We've seen Paul Simon, Tori Amos. We've got people saying it's the new drug of choice. It's the bees, the klaxons are all saying they've been inspired by ayahuasca at that point. So I'm just wrapping up now, really. So here is some visual stuff for you. That's on the left there. That's from the 1990 to 2019, all the newspaper articles by publication, just so you can get a general sense, and try to do this one over here, this little circle chart, to kind of shade it, just to kind of represent the kind of political leanings of the publications and their interests, with the independent in grey there, as they are meant to be independent. So, but we can see it's actually quite a fair balance. Liberal press and more conservative press have taken interest. There were examples of a little bit of fear mongering and things like that. Obviously, we've seen deaths in retreats and things like that, so they would always kick off a little spurge of articles in those times. And then going back to academic stuff, so that same chart again there, and then with my data added on the other side, and then with my with my Open Athens search below, and then the two combined there on the right, so just to see how much it took off at that time. And it's here now, it's a field, we're here, and we're discussing it, and thank you very much for your time and attention. I'm done now, and all my references are there, and you can get the slides if you want to. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Awesome, thank you for that, Kerry. Crazy about that 2005 Extreme Celebrity Detox.
I know.
I don't think it was the sort of thing I would have watched anyway, but it's amazing that slipped me by. Before we jump into any questions, there have been a couple of private messages asking if we can advise about places to take ayahuasca, but unfortunately, just being a university society, that's not something we can really condone. I'll take the host prerogative and just start off. What do you think you'd be doing if you'd started this PhD 10 years later? Like, I don't know if any of your obviously very thorough reading could make you think about what sorts of trends are going on right now that in 10 years' time we'll look back and say, this is when it hit the big time.
Oh, gosh. So you asked me to kind of think of the one thing that really has made it explode. I don't think there has, but I think it's been a slow drip. It's been a slow drip of kind of coming in through, the beat poetry and coming in through kind of particular forms of music and cultural references, and I couldn't say what has, that 2005 boom of Peruvian tourism. It's just people hearing, it's how it happens, isn't it? People, word on the street gets around, and and it grows. But yeah, so in terms of trends for 10 years time, what should we be writing about then? I'm not sure.
I guess that's kind of an unfair question. You don't ask historians to extrapolate and then predict
from the future. Yeah.
I know Rain has a question. I'll unmute you for that.
Yeah, so what do you think is the main reason why there was such a delayed widestream acceptance of ayahuasca? Because it really seems like it only became mainstream thing in the 2000s. So do you think it was just the accessibility, or was it just overshadowed by all the other substances available in the 60s and onwards?
I think you've touched on two very important answers already. Definitely the the fact that we were already distracted by LSD, and we were finding, you know, psilocybin and finding our way with that, and in a sense those substances, you know, culturally moved us away from you know, conforming as such. And with ayahuasca, there's all these trimmings that it's actually more about conforming, all these kind of religious, spiritual things that come with it, you know, so that even though they're both psychedelics and you know, we're interested in both, there is a slight difference there, and absolutely accessibility and getting over there. And you know, that a lot of people aren't reading Burroughs, you know, very select readership, and you know, very select kind of market for who would start reading that sort of literature and listening to that sort of music, and you know, and how much that would influence, you know, if you were a Tori Amos fan, I doubt, you know, many that, you know, there's a significant number of her fan base that have gone, oh, I need to check out ayahuasca. I doubt that's been a thing. But yeah, I think with all kind of novel things, well, it's not novel, is it? But you know, when we learn about a new phenomenon, that it's not, it takes time, doesn't it? It takes time for people to and the audience to build around it, and you know. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah,
next
thanks.
up, Sebastian. You are unmuted, Seb.
Hi, yeah. So my question is, how do you see the direction of this sort of academic interest in the field moving forwards in the next couple of years? And also, do you think there's going to be another explosion now with sort of the biggest podcast in the world being Joe Rogan's openly talking about this type of experience?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think he does a bad job of it. I'm not particularly a fan, and I'm not particularly a fan of some of his kind of political leanings at all. But you know, in terms of his covering his discussion of ayahuasca and DMT, I don't think he does it a disservice at all, and he's certainly, you know, bringing it to a massive audience. But where do I see it going academically? I think you know, we understand the plants, we understand the chemicals, we understand how they work with our brain. I think now really it's a time of, you know, we're looking more at the kind of you know, I think there'll be, hopefully, you know, is getting research funding for, you know, psychedelic research is quite difficult, and a lot of that is currently going into you know, psilocybin and using that therapeutically, and MDMA and using that therapeutically, and hopefully I'd like to see that happen with ayahuasca at least. But I think ayahuasca is a little bit more problematic than those other substances because of this strong sense of you know, religious epiphany that comes with it, and you know, would you know, from a you know, UK government perspective, or the NHS perspective, would it be ethical to have you know, an alcoholic, or you know, substance someone with substance misuse issues, or someone that's incredibly depressed, and put them in a position where you're likely to influence their religious perspective, or you know, you've got to have, you know, these kind of religious frills that come with the delivery of the treatment, you know. So in order to maintain a sense of respect, you know, we need to be mindful of exploitation of the you know, the indigenous culture, and how we integrate their customs into our society, and that has to be done with great sensitivity for both societies, you know, and so hopefully I'd like to see a lot of work going on around that personally, and how to integrate that, and how we would be able to make it right and proper for all involved, you know, to be able to utilize ayahuasca in the UK or in the Occident world for as a treatment, but also if people want as a spiritual tool, you know. So that's my thoughts. Thank you. Thank you very much. Good question.
In the interest of time, we're just going to have to curtail it to 2 more. So next up is Sam Gledhill. Let me just unmute you. Go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, great. I'm unmuted. Hello, thank you for your talk, Kerry. I'll try and keep this quick. We've had a few comments from yourself and other people alluding to the limited uptake of ayahuasca as compared to other psychoactive substances. And I'm wondering to what extent you reflected on that being related to other substances being more recreationally uptaken on the basis of them being simply an easier and a more suitable drug to be recreationally.
Yeah, I think absolutely. The fact that we know that ayahuasca can make you vomit, it can make you have diarrhea. We know that you can have bad trips with LSD and psilocybin, but I think there's a whole lot more with ayahuasca that's off-putting to some. The whole fact that, you know, that the spiritual aspects of it are off-putting. You know, we're drifting towards becoming a much more secular society here, and it kind of it fights against that grain. So I think, you know, that there is, you know, especially when people are trying to access it in the UK for a long time, we were, you know, it was relatively underground, but still there was a kind of sense of security that, oh, if we do get caught, we can rely on the Human Rights Act. But that, you know, that fell away. You know, when we saw the Feldman case, was it Feldman? Sorry, I've forgotten his name at the moment. There was there was a case. I think it came to head in about 2015, where essentially there was Santa Daim practicing in the UK, and were caught with gallons and gallons of ayahuasca, and it was dragged out for a few years, and eventually the charges were dropped based on a lack of evidence. But we know there was an awful lot of evidence there that they were distributing ayahuasca, so that it's speculated that case was dropped because it was just a can of worms, and the UK courts didn't want to open that can of worms in terms of, you know, allowing religious use of a psychedelic. So I think definitely there's a lot more kind of probably not the right word, but baggage that comes with ayahuasca, a lot more add-ons, a lot more peripheral things. You know, the fact that you've got to go through a week-long diet, and you're supposed to have a sexual abstinence is off-putting for some as well. And you know, so I think you don't get the sense that, you know, when you, so as a new user or a novel user, that you're going to you know, have diarrhea when you take magic mushrooms. But you can, you know. You know, we don't, it's not oh, you're going to throw up, you know, you can, but it's not as strongly associated, is it? And so I think, yeah, that the fact that it was coming through quite select channels in terms of the type of person that was originally taking interest and going, oh, you know, there's something to this, yeah, I think yeah, definitely the kind of spiritual ideas around it have probably put some people off, for sure. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
And finally, Alice.
Oh, hi. So I think the question after mine is pretty similar too. So I could just try to summarize both of them in one, which is that obviously ayahuasca has been used for a long time by indigenous people. So it's not new, but it's new to us.
Yes.
So can you say something about what the impact could be on them, or has been on them, of the surge in popularity in the West?
Yeah. It's concerning. There's a lot to be concerned about, and I mean, you've got the indigenous people that, you know, but then you've got the people that are local, you know, that live in Peru, live in Brazil, that may, you know, that are most likely of Portuguese descent, and that are picking it up, and they, you know, there's no reason they couldn't train, and they couldn't you know, deliver safe rituals, but there's certainly an exploitation aspect that, you know, that they're chopping down, you know, vines that have been grown for thousands of years, and these things take about 7 years to regrow to a point where you could harvest them again. So there's certainly in the sense of, you know, just going and clearing, you know, thousand-year-old plants out of the jungle, that's not great for anybody, and you know, and that not being sustainable. They're massive concerns. But I don't know how many European tourists actually, you know, really get to meet the truly indigenous groups, and I don't think it's really for me to kind of determine whether or not that would be a positive thing or not for those groups. I think, you know, I don't think I have the information to kind of make that judgment call really, but hopefully they have contact with ayahuasca tourists at a level, and you know, on a kind of you know, found on a level that they're happy with, you know, and that they feel they have some sense of control over, because you know, they have a right to make money from it if they want to, and they have a right to deliver those rituals if they want to, but they also have a right to kind of stay hidden in their communities in the jungle. So yeah, the deforestation aspect of it worries me, and you know, like we saw with Maria Sabina and the magic mushrooms, you can't not make that comparison, you know, of how we couldn't I don't know, we did spoil it there, I think, the Westerners, and Maria Sabina. There's no denying that, and I think it'd be a massive shame if we don't learn from that lesson, really. Personally, does that answer your question, Alice?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Kerry. Just the last few questions, there was a trio of really interesting interrelated questions about Indigenous cultures and this interface between Western use and this quite fragile ecosystems and social systems in comparison to the bulk of the West. So for the people that are interested in that, I just want to flag that our second symposium in 8th week, I think mid-June, one of the speakers is Anna Makova, who's doing a lot of work on conservation of psychedelics, and that's kind of understood broadly to be both ecological conservation as well as social conservation. So there'll be plenty more time to operate on that. All right, thank you, Kay.
Thank you.
All right, now it is my great pleasure to introduce Mr. Sam Gandy. So Sam is a PhD trained ecologist. Later worked as science officer at the Beckley Foundation just down the way, and is currently now affiliated with Robin Carhart-Harris and the gang at Imperial.
Oh, hi, can you still hear me? I can see me, but no one else.
Yes, we hear you.
Cool. Shall I thank you for the intro? Lovely to be here. Shall I, I've got my presentation here, my slides. Shall I what's the old...
Do your thing. Share screen down in the bottom bar.
Yes. Cool. Okay. And...
Great.
Yeah, I need to make it go slideshow. Ah, there we go. Just a sec. Okay. So, I'm going to be talking about psychedelics and our connection to nature. So, just obviously, this is an ayahuasca-focused talk, and ayahuasca is a part of this. But I should note that the bulk of the research on this has been on psilocybin so far. And I don't think that in any way invalidates ayahuasca in this regard. It's just not been researched much. But it's worth noting that, you know, chemically, it's pretty close to mushrooms, like some people consider psilocybin, orally active DMT, some scientists. And so chemically and also phenomenologically, they're pretty close on the psychedelic Venn diagram. to each other than, say, mescaline or LSD. So I think I can say with a fair degree of certainty that what applies to psilocybin is likely to apply to ayahuasca to a fair degree. So I'm just going to move this menu a bit out of the way. So just briefly to explain what I mean when I say nature connectedness or relatedness. So this isn't just the same as, say, going out into nature and looking at nature. This is a measure of one's self-identification with nature, or one's experiential feeling of oneness with the natural world. And so it's something direct and emotional. It's not an intellectual understanding. And it has a few important psychological health well-being effects. So firstly, it's sort of associated strongly with numerous measures of psychological well-being. Among them, life satisfaction, life meaning, vitality, and decreased anxiety. It also acts as an important mediator of some of the benefits of actually spending time in nature, the perceived restorativeness of natural settings, attentional capacity, and a number of other things. It also predicts the likelihood of actually spending time in nature. And that's really important because the health effects of nature immersion are even more impressive than nature connectedness. So the two things, nature connectedness and nature contact or immersion, are distinct and yet sort of strongly overlapping and mutually reinforcing. It's also interesting and worth noting, we are in the midst of a growing mental health crisis and a growing ecological crisis. And one of the other interesting side effects of this deepening connection with nature is that it's a strong psychological predictor, if not the single strongest predictor of pro-environmental behavior. And that's important and interesting given that we're orchestrating the 6th mass extinction of life on this planet, and there is a lack of notable interventions for reversing humans' environmentally destructive behavior. It should also be noted, before I go into this, that just the simple acknowledgement of nature, taking time to sort of observe and acknowledge and appreciate nature, is a pathway to connectedness in a broad sense, including to people and life as a whole. And this is very important because connectedness is strongly associated with positive mental health, and disconnection is strongly associated with things like depression and addiction and other things. So yeah, this is one of the earliest sort of survey studies that I've saw on this by my friend, colleague, Dr. David Luke. And here he was looking at different psychedelic and sort of psychotropic plants and agents, and looking at their ability to facilitate nature connection and ecological concern, or sort of disconnection and lack of concern. And so interestingly here, psilocybin mushrooms are definitely top of the pile in terms of facilitating connection and also concern. And then sort of, LSD and ayahuasca are sort of roughly kind of, evenly matched second to that. And so this is interesting in that, well, firstly, I think there's a few sort of things here, because obviously ayahuasca, some people might be surprised ayahuasca doesn't rate more highly. And obviously ayahuasca is used in, principally, but elsewhere in the Amazon rainforest, which is one of the most biodiverse parts of this amazing planet. So, but ayahuasca, it tends to be quite strict. The context of usage around ayahuasca, it tends to be used, even when it's might be sort of in natural environments, it tends to be used in kind of indoor or sort of ceremonial settings or contexts. And my own experience of doing it in Peru, I was very much discouraged from leaving the Maloca or leaving the inside space, so the shaman could keep an eye on me. So, you know, if you went to the loo, you had to come straight back and sort of not dawdle and go and explore. LSD and psilocybin are very different to this. They're much more, I would consider them much more user-friendly psychedelics than ayahuasca. Ayahuasca, as well as the strict ceremonial context of usage, it tends to make you dizzy and it can make you sick, and it's sort of pretty hard going on the body. Whereas LSD, very much not so, and then psilocybin mushrooms tend less so as well. So you can kind of, you're much more able and maybe liable to sort of go out into nature and explore. And we know from research looking at nature connectedness sort of without psychedelics that, yeah, contact with nature is a strong predictor of nature connectedness. So it kind of makes sense that access to natural settings will increase it. It should also, it's interesting to note here that ketamine is kind of an inverse psychedelic. So people on ketamine, they tend to sort of become much less connected, it seems, to nature, and much less concern for it. Maybe sort of part of its dissociative effect. But yeah, you can see that ketamine fiends are not going to usher in the ecological age of Aquarius that we hope to maybe see dawning before we make ourselves and much of our life extinct. So a little bit of research that's been done on ayahuasca that's interesting. Users have been found to rate more highly in a measure of self-transcendence, which is related to also openness, which psychedelics also affect. And it's the sort of this concept of the boundaries of self expanding beyond the individual and sort of encompassing a much broader kind of Gaian whole. And this is in turn a significant predictor of nature relatedness and environmental concern. So, as mentioned, much of the research done so far has been on psilocybin, looking at sort of people's relationship to nature and the environment, and also their nature connectedness. And so in both clinical populations and healthy populations, this sort of long-term increase in people's positive increase in people's relationship to nature and environment, and also their connection to nature, is observed. So there was one paper that pulled data from 8 different studies using healthy volunteers by a Swiss research group using psilocybin, and they found that 12 to 18 months post experience, a third of people reported an enduring shift in their sort of relationship to nature and the environment. And this is interesting because the environment, the setting that they sort of psilocybin was administered was very clinical. In some cases, it was a PET brain scanner, which is about as clinical environment as you can get, and people really didn't particularly like that setting. So I think this is really interesting. And just to sort of lead on now to study by Imperial, again, this was looking at a subsample of major depression study participants who psilocybin, high dose psilocybin was being used to treat depression. And again, an enduring increase in nature relatedness was observed, 7 to 12 months post experience. And again, the psilocybin was administered in a clinical environment, sort of lacking in nature. So this is really interesting because the sort of, the bulk of research that falls out of psychedelics and nature relatedness shows that being in nature and engaged emotionally in nature is the pathway towards increasing nature relatedness. So the fact that psychedelics can increase it in spite of the lack of a natural setting is, I think, very interesting. And it hints that this is something intrinsic to the psychedelic state. My friend and sort of scientific collaborator, Chris Timmerman, who Eddie mentioned earlier, he has this term biodelic, that psychedelics, it sort of tune people into the inner processes and the outer processes of life, which I think is very interesting and compelling. So this was an interesting study, and this was by Sir Matthias Forssmann and his colleague Christina at Yale. And they did this quite elegant study where they found that lifetime experience with psychedelics predicted pro-environmental behavior through an increase in nature relatedness, through this increase of self-identification with nature. So yeah, it seems that sort of as one's connection to the world increases, this sort of a concern for it kind of rises. It sort of also increases as a side effect of this deepening connection. And it should be noted that speaking to Matthias recently, some unpublished data he's got, he found that there's something quite special about psilocybin in this regard, even compared to other psychedelics like LSD and mescaline. And this also echoes David Luke's findings as well, that psilocybin seems to be top of the pile when it comes to facilitating increased nature connection and the concern that stems from it. And that's also worth noting that, you know, ayahuasca, we've all, you know, I've got great reverence for ayahuasca, but it's an alien plant to our ecosystem. You know, it's an Amazonian plant principally, and psilocybin is our indigenous psychedelic. It grows wild, you know, on our funny little island, you know, and so that's something sort of worth bearing in mind. So this is some of the research that I was involved in at Imperial, and so what we found here was, so along the bottom, along the x-axis, you've got total number of experiences of sessions with classical psychedelics, and then sort of the y-axis going up is nature relatedness at baseline. So pre sort of anyone having any further psychedelic use subsequent to our survey. So it's a prospective survey measuring before, immediately after, and then long term after a psychedelic experience. So we found this very, very strong relationship that prior lifetime total psychedelic use very strongly predicted people's baseline nature relatedness. At the same time, we also found that people, psychedelic naive people who had no prior experience with psychedelics, there was also a significant increase in their nature relatedness as well post-experience. Echoing other research, we also found that the increase in nature relatedness was strongly associated with a concomitant increase in well-being as well. And importantly, the two predictors, the positive predictors of increased nature relatedness, were access to and the perceived importance of natural environments and ego dissolution experiences under the psychedelic. And here are just a few sort of nice from some of the psilocybin trials at Imperial, how this sort of enhanced nature connectedness can come about. Before I enjoyed nature, now I feel part of it. Before I was looking at it as a thing, like a TV or a painting. You're part of it, there's no separation or distinction, you are it. I felt like sunshine twinkling through leaves. I was nature. So this is some very fresh, unpublished data presented at the Horizons conference last year by Taylor Lyons, who's leading what I think is a very interesting study at Imperial that's wrapped up now in the sort of data analysis and sort of pre-publication stage. Yeah, this psilocybin insight study. So looking at the brain effects and the psychology effects of psilocybin in healthy psychedelic naive volunteers and looking at the long-term effects on the brain and psychology. And here you can see sort of on the right here that there was this very robust increase in connectedness to nature, and it was at the higher still at 3 months than after sort of, yeah, just after the session itself of the 2 and 4 weeks, which is really interesting. And yes, as mentioned, there's this positive reciprocal feedback loop between connectedness to nature and contact with nature. The more connected to nature you feel, the more value you tend to place on it, the more time you tend to make and spend time in it. and that's got huge implications for health and well-being. So another important effect psychedelics have in an enduring sense is they can increase personality trait openness. So this is one of the 5 measures of personality, and it's associated with a number of traits, including appreciation for aesthetics, which is something quite important relating to nature, perception of beauty, hunger for knowledge, and taking value in other people's views and perspectives, things like that. But openness is it's the strongest personality correlate with nature connectedness. Another important thing to mention is that psychedelics have also been found, and this includes ayahuasca, psilocybin, and 5-MeO-DMT, have all been found to elicit sustained increases in measures of mindfulness. And this is outside the context of the mindfulness meditation practice. And this is interesting, as mindfulness is strongly related to nature connection. And they have this, again, this positively reinforcing reciprocal relationship. So the more connected to nature you are, the more mindful you will be or tend to be, and vice versa. And mindfulness also acts as a mediator of the well-being effects one gains while being in nature. And another common mechanism that links both psychedelics and the experience of being in nature is the experience of awe. So here, sort of described quite scientifically as stimuli that are vast, that transcend current frames of reference, and that require new schemata to accommodate what is being perceived. So as mentioned, one of the principal mechanisms by which psychedelics seem to increase nature connectedness, and this is something that's come up in both correlative research and also prospective research that I've been involved in, is the experience of ego dissolution. And what this graphic is sort of condensing is the increase in global connectivity in the brain. So in the psychedelic, under the psychedelic influence in the psychedelic state, and this is something we see with both psilocybin and LSD, so it seems a principal part of the psychedelic brain state. Within sort of certain brain hubs in localized areas, there's an actual decrease in connection, whereas in the whole of the brain, there's this increase in connection. So usually compartmentalized, separate, distinct regions of the brain start linking up and talking to each other effectively. And when you have a good dose of psilocybin, it affects one's ego. And the ego is, the self-referential sense of self is thought to reside primarily in the default mode network. And under a high dose of a psychedelic like psilocybin, the default mode network can become increasingly relaxed and then dissolve altogether. And when this occurs, it seems that the perceived boundaries between self and other dissolve. And this can facilitate this expanded perspective of self-nature overlap. And particularly, I feel if you're already in a natural setting, it's going to sort of maximize the connectivity to the external unity you feel in that state. So and in terms of the eco-psychological implications of this, I think this is a quote from a conference, a gathering of eco-psychologists 30 years ago, that I think they weren't applying it to the psychedelic state, but it applies, I think, very well. If the self is expanded to include the natural world, behavior leading to destruction of the world will be experienced as self-destruction. And it's important to note that Albert Hofmann, who I'm sure you're all well aware of, when he sort of came to the end of his life and he was reflecting on his life's work, he came to view that the capacity for psychedelics to reconnect our nature alienated species back to nature was probably their most fundamentally important property beyond all else, and I share that sentiment. And he said, alienation from nature and the loss of the experience of being part of the living creation is the greatest tragedy of our materialistic era. It is the causative reason for ecological devastation and climate change. Therefore, I attribute absolute highest importance to consciousness change. I regard psychedelics as catalyzers for this. Thank you.
Amazing, thanks for that, Sam. We'll head on to questions in a minute, but I'll field one first of all. So Festi Valha is a psychotherapist who's interested in getting involved in psychedelic research and wants to know how to go about that. Yeah, it's actually pretty hard at the moment. So in the UK, there isn't an official training module for psychotherapists that are interested in getting involved with this. Which is part of the reason why I'm quite skeptical of the think pieces going around saying psychedelics are going to solve the COVID-related mental health crisis, because there simply isn't the infrastructure for that. You will be interested in Googling a company called Fluence, who, so they're run by Elizabeth Nielsen, who was a psychotherapist at NYU and has also done training with MAPS. So they run some online courses. That might be your best first port call. But a question from Sam to Sam. Sam Gledhill, you're on.
Hello, thank you. Just a quick comment on what you were just talking about. I'm familiar with an organization called Psychedelics Today in the United States who have been running fairly in-depth, what I believe to be courses for therapists wanting to move into the space. I haven't been on any myself, but they look really interesting, and I hope to explore that which they have to offer once I'm done with my degree. My question to you, Sam, is I was really interested in what you had to say about the fact that ayahuasca is typically consumed inside, and that possibly being a reason why where it doesn't show up as eliciting as much connectedness to nature. I think I agree with you, and I like the point, but I wanted to ask a slightly tangential question, which was thinking about, for example, different strains of mushrooms eliciting quite different experiences, some being highly introspective and some being more of an outward connectedness. And I wondered whether you thought there was also an argument to be made for ayahuasca eliciting more of an introspective experience and consequently eliciting less of a sense of connectedness with the outside world.
Yeah, that's very interesting, actually. So I'm a sort of advocate of, well, in my experience, different species of mushroom definitely do have their own, for lack of a better word, character, agenda, vibe, and some of them do really seem to be much more. I know obviously there's the certain setting factors, but I've kind of explored these things a bit, and I get the feeling that some are much more externally focused than others, and some are, in that sense, actually some species are better for therapeutic work than others, and others maybe have different applications. And yes, I think ayahuasca is primarily an introspective experience. And actually, I've noticed, because I've experienced it myself, and the sort of the magic seems to be principally happening when you're sitting or lying down with eyes closed, and it's sort of like doing its thing there. And sometimes when you kind of open your eyes, there's not sometimes a whole lot sort of going on. And sometimes that very much also applies to mushrooms, but not all the time. And yeah, sometimes one might want to kind of lie back and sit and go inwards, where other times that seems to be very much not what's on the cards, and it's much more of an external getting out into nature and sort of appreciating that. So yeah, I do think that sort of different species vary, and yes, I think sort of the introspective internal focused perhaps sort of nature of ayahuasca makes it maybe less predisposed, because it seems that it's the external unity, it's the outer connectedness that seems to be important here with the nature connectedness.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Great. In the interest of time, I'm going to have to curtail it to one more. Ivan, if you go ahead.
Yeah, hi. So when you talk about nature, I assume that it's the sort of common intuition of there being nature as in trees and animals, etc., and there being non-nature as in urban environments and man-made environments. But in experience where one feels themselves as part of nature, how does that intuition hold up, and how can we distinguish between relatedness to the trees and forest nature and relatedness to like the universe?
So yeah, that's a good question. Someone, I can't remember where he's based in the States, has been in touch a little while back, and he's developed a cosmic connections scale. And I think it's really important, because this connectedness does go far beyond just nature, and it can go much deeper and become a kind of universal cosmic level of phenomenon. But let me just see, is that your question you've got written down here? So sorry, yes, can you run sort of that past me again, in terms of, are you also flagging the whole sort of nature, non-nature, but it's all nature? Or is that sort of...
Yeah, I'd say.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, so it is all nature, and I do totally get that argument. I'm an advocate of that, but I think it's useful to distinguish in terms of, we know from the research, like very much so, that there is a huge difference in how human beings respond psychologically and physiologically to sort of like inanimate natural environments. You know, nature that's not been, I mean, all our nature in the UK has been manicured and manipulated to hell, but the effect that trees and greenery and water and sort of natural non-human built habitats have is very different to, say, walking down a busy traffic laden street. And so, and then the kind of the nature relatedness or the nature connectedness scales are effectively, you ask people different questions about how they relate to or enjoy or value nature, and they answer on this kind of like sliding scale. And that sounds maybe a little bit crude, but it's like the only way to kind of get data on these things is you have to ask people, you know. And like, I'm all for the mechanistic neuroscientific side of things, but brain scans, and they are very important, but brain scans can only tell you so much. They can only take you so far. You need to ask people. Like my good friend Ros Watts, through her qualitative research, through asking people 6 months on from her psilocybin research at Imperial, found that this theme of disconnection, depression being linked to disconnection, and psilocybin worked in part by facilitating this reconnection, not just to nature, but to inner self and to other people. And that was kind of a novel finding, and like no amount of brain scans would have picked that up. It has to be qualitatively assessed and diagnosed. So yeah, you have to sort of speak to people and sort of get a feel for these things. I don't know if that answered your question. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Last up to bat is Adam Knowles. So in a previous life, Adam spent a good 2 decades working in tech. He was previously the chair of LGBT Humanists, and he's currently a psychotherapist practicing in London. Alongside that, he's doing a PhD in ritual use of ayahuasca for insight and healing. Last year, he was awarded the prize for social sciences research in psychedelics by Breaking Convention, which, if you don't know, is Europe's biggest psychedelic conference by far. At Birkbeck, he's using interpretive phenomenological analysis and is working alongside colleagues at King's College London's Institute of Psychiatry, which is where their psychedelic team is based. He's due in the next couple of years to collect some data at the Ayahuasca Foundation in Peru, but tonight he is here with us. Adam.
Hello, thanks Eddie, great to be here. I was just noticing that I'm not quite as well groomed as my profile photograph due to the circumstances in which we meet. I did shave today, knowing that I was on for Oxford Psychedelic Society, so I've done my best. And otherwise, maybe Sam has kind of preempted my entire talk by saying that the brain scans only tell you so much, and that after that we have to ask people. I mean, that's basically my entire theme. But it's great. It's a great. So thanks for that, Sam. It's true. I'm going to say a bit more about that. I'm going to say a bit more specifically about it. As Eddie said, I am half psychotherapist, half ayahuasca researcher, and I split my time professionally, at least, between those two things. I've done some past research, which won the Breaking Convention Prize. I'm going to try not to necessarily repeat too much of what I said in that talk, which is available on YouTube, just because I think the Venn diagram of the two audiences may be, well, I don't want to bore you particularly, Eddie. I know you've seen it, and I bore myself, so I want to say something new about it. So I'll talk about my current research, a bit about my past research, and then it's already come up about psychotherapy, about training for psychotherapy, and what aspects of ayahuasca are therapeutic, and what other effects they may have. Thanks for the history from Kerry. That was really really interesting, and helps with my literature review, which is very welcome as well. Thanks, Kerry. About the increasing prevalence of ayahuasca in the UK, of course, as covered by the media. But anyway, without any further ado, let me get into it. Actually, I've forgotten. As a psychotherapist, I'm used to being very strict with timings, and so what I'm going to do is set myself a let's say 17 minutes, and I'll try and bring myself in under that, just so that I can engage with people. Some of the questions have been really interesting so far, so I'd love to hear. Please do think of any questions you want to ask me or perhaps the others. I'd be very willing to engage with that. First of all, I will cover a bit about my past research. That was qualitative research. I used a methodology called interpretative phenomenological analysis, which is the main reason I didn't have a drink before coming on tonight, because I didn't think I'd be able to say it anymore. It's quite a complicated word, but it's important to say that it's phenomenological, which is a philosophical state of mind, going back to the things themselves in the word of Husserl, who kind of captured a lot of what we now refer to as phenomenology. But it's basically, what's the best way to describe it? Working in a lot of depth, in great detail, in it's really precise work, and I think part of what I want to convey tonight is about really how scientific it is. I'm blowing the trumpet for the scientific status of qualitative research and of phenomenological research, IPA specifically, for giving us answers to questions that quantitative research can't answer or doesn't answer, and in a sense doesn't want to answer, and the compatibility of these different ways of talking, or as Wittgenstein might call them, language games. That's how I think of them, that these are not competing, they're compatible language games, where what is it we're talking about, and what I'm mainly talking about is experience. I interviewed 4 people for an hour each, and from those I detected some themes, constructed some themes, I suppose, within that data, and these were them. The first was our telephone line back to source, which is about insights and changes. One of my participants gave up a lifelong addiction to drugs as a result of his ayahuasca experience. At least he credits the ayahuasca experiences with a significant correlation, a significant, more than that, significant factor in his giving up drugs and being able to do that. And another of my participants switched from a life that was a bit sort of narcissistic, a bit, and that's in their own words, a bit focused on themselves, to being a life focused on others, a bit more altruistic, and they found these changes were positive. So, and indeed, I myself find myself here talking to you directly as a result of, not as a result of, I don't want to get into causality too much and or be too simplistic about it, but certainly what I can say for sure is that ayahuasca was an important part of my experience that led me to retrain as a psychotherapist after 20 years in technology. And it's something that I continue to be interested in as a psychotherapist and a psychedelic researcher. The second theme was, I called it, I ended up in my father's psyche. That's from a quote from my participant. So sticking to the words the participants use themselves rather than any words of mine, any kind of scale or inventory that might say, you know, do you feel more connected to nature, or do you feel more connected to God, or do you, you know, those are the, that's a kind of top-down view in a way that phenomenology is always bottom up and saying, well, in your own words, you know, completely free, you're free to say absolutely anything you want. What do you want to tell me? And then trying to find the patterns. One of my participants said, I ended up in my father's psyche when he was 5. Basically, his mother disappeared, but they didn't tell him what had happened. So, and this was a revelation for her. Another participant said, it's just moving beyond your range. And if you can get 360, it's a different vista. So really, this is about ayahuasca and perspective. If you're interested in the mechanism of ayahuasca, how it might be working, I think perspective is one of the things that you might want to talk about. They also talked about ayahuasca as a distinct or separate consciousness, perhaps with its own manifesto. The meeting, and I think you covered this in your introduction, Eddie, about mama ayahuasca and a mother ayahuasca as a kind of being, as an entity, as a consciousness that you meet as much as you just kind of playing around with your own self, you know, and these questions are of selfhood and meeting entities came up as well in the research. So, and I think that theme too connects the most to Sam's presentation. I think that nature, remembering, discovering that you are part of nature. We are part. I am nature. You know, in a sense, is nothing that's man-made, because nature made me. So nature made whatever it is. You know, this kind of identification again that I really feel personally, and as a result of my ayahuasca experiences, was there in the data from my past participants. The third theme that I found of these 5 was watch loads of ballet. My participant said, you might watch loads of ballet. I can't do his accent. You might watch loads of ballet. You might go running on the beach. Anything that helps you become conscious of yourself. So he thought being conscious of yourself was the key move for him. Another participant said, I did cognitive behavioral therapy. I did that alongside microdosing mushrooms. So they were talking about other routes to the same discoveries, the same states that ayahuasca gives you. I think ayahuasca can be quite a, you know, a heavy, as Sam was saying, you know, it's maybe not that user friendly. Yeah, I get that. It's a pretty hardcore way of getting to a certain place, a certain state of mind, and there are other ways. Obviously, Stanislav Grof had a breathing technique that's still quite popular. Jung used active imagination. You could argue that gets you, you know, these sweat lodges and all sort of transformative breathing. Lots of different ways of accessing a somewhat similar, or you could argue psychedelic state. Although some legitimately argue that psychedelic states can only be accessed via psychedelic substances, and I think that's a reasonable argument. But otherwise, my participants anyway were saying there are other paths of healing, and ayahuasca is not exclusive in providing access to them, although it's a fairly reliable route to some of this stuff. The fourth one was gets you off your head, which was one of my participants said, when I sat down with a lady, she said, look, it's a medicine. We call it medicine for a reason. And that day I was like, rah, rah, it doesn't get you off your head. It's a drug, rah, rah. So and this is the guy that gave up his drugs addiction as a result of taking, which, you know, you could think of it as a drug. So that didn't make sense to him. So this question of ayahuasca as a drug versus a plant medicine versus a sacrament under the religious versions of it. Again, it's these language games. You know, how do you think of it, and what you label it determines to a great extent how you will treat it. And my participants struggled with that, the different ways of conceiving of ayahuasca. Another participant said, ayahuasca is a medicine. It's something that we use to heal ourselves. It's not something that people can use to get high because it tastes so horrible. And again, I can attest to that. But this might be a good point to mention that all of my participants said that the difficulties, yes, it's not user friendly, but the difficulties of purging, vomiting, diarrhea, sweating, salivating, being dizzy, all of that stuff, most of them made sense of that experience as a profoundly worthwhile thing. They found that it was the more difficult, one of my participants said, the more difficult it got, the more insights they got, and rather than, I think she called it rainbows and unicorns. I'll leave the rainbows and unicorns every day. I don't care about those. Give me the hard, gritty, dark stuff. And that's where I met, for instance, she was the one that said about the meeting being inside her father's psyche at 5 years old. So it's difficult stuff, but it's worthwhile in their view. And then my final theme was Three Guys with Feathers, about intercultural exchange, thousands of years of ceremony, my participants said. The full quote was, you just see, and actually this is a different quote about the difficulties. Actually, it's come up in the discussion about is this cultural appropriation? Is this new colonialism? All good questions. And it's there in the discourse, and it's there for my participants. The quote was, you just see all the work and all the people involved, all the locals, practically enslaved for the benefit of my experience. It just didn't feel right. So for some, that difference and diversity is worthwhile. For some, it's damaging. Obviously, it's probably a mix in reality. And I think that alludes to Kerry's topic about kind of urban shamanism and what's called the benefits and risks of a spreading tradition. So benefits and risks, that's the even-handed way to talk about it. So those are my findings so far from my qualitative research. And some of that we'll find parallels in other research. Some of it felt quite new, or at least worded differently, as you'd expect. Moving to my other aspect, so that's my ayahuasca researcher side of me. Moving to the psychotherapy side, so I work every day as a psychotherapist. Part of the reason I'm interested in ayahuasca is because it might provide some avenues for particularly things like PTSD, which MDMA is being researched heavily for at the moment, and psilocybin for depression and things is being researched. So the question then is, well, ayahuasca for what? And some people have some ideas about that. I think it's quite a sort of general insight, and it could work for one of my participants. It worked for a drugs addiction. It's shown some worthwhile results in terms of anxiety and depression. I think broadly you could separate ayahuasca and psychotherapy into two branches. One is psychedelic experiences to assist therapy, as in the therapeutic purposes of ayahuasca and psychedelics, and the other is therapy to help with ayahuasca experiences, or to broadly to integrate psychedelic experiences. So that's where I spend most of my days on the second one. I've already talked in a sense in that first segment about the first one, about how psychedelic experiences can be therapeutic. I think there's growing evidence for that, and I intend to do more, as I'll mention in a moment. But on the second point about therapy to assist psychedelic experiences, because clearly, some experiences they can be traumatic, they can be difficult. People can go for years, decades after an LSD trip, struggling to know why they feel broken and not themselves anymore. That it changed something? Did it fry their brain? And these are good questions, and the evidence base, given the hiatus in research since the 60s, is difficult to reference. For what it's worth, I would say to anybody that's looking for help with psychedelic integration to find the right therapist rather than the right psychedelic therapist. And this relates to the training point that came up earlier as well. That I think a basic training in general psychotherapy is absolutely what's called for. A lot of these courses, of course, are designed for therapists to do as essentially as continuing professional development. That makes sense to me. What makes less sense is training people only in psychotherapy, taking someone from a non-therapist to a fully fledged thing via a purely psychedelic route. I'm a little bit worried about that, I suppose, because I think the point for me is that in my client work, the psychedelics aren't the problem. It's what's revealed by the psychedelics that they really need to deal with. So it's never having felt welcome, having a fundamentally depressed view of themselves, not feeling confident. whatever it is, it's not the LSD, it's not the ayahuasca that we need to talk about. It's their self-esteem, it's their confidence, it's their anxiety, it's their experience in romantic relationships, just the same as, in a sense, non-psychedelic psychotherapy. And for that, I think you need a general training. So the things that come up, that's the view of the psychedelic as a kind of amplifier of what's already there, rather than kind of adding anything in itself. Yeah, so that's kind of approaching the things that lie behind the experience rather than the experience itself. I do think that, and again, my experience and that of my participants is that, the psychedelic experiences are worthwhile. I guess I'm not talking about it for recreational use, it's an imperfect phrase, but it's for therapeutic use that I'm primarily researching it. I think it tends to be 1% inspiration, 99% perspiration. There's a lot of work that you need to do, that I've had to do, that my clients have to do, to work through an experience, make sense of it, and come through the other side, in a sense. And that can, of course, be circular. They can then return to psychedelics and then revisit, reconsult Mama Ayahuasca, for instance, and then come back to therapy to talk it through and to kind of bring that bit that Sam showed, the kind of lack of default, the default mode networks changing, and the sense of self diminishing, the sense of directedness diminishing, and the sense of who I am opens you up to a whole new load of new perspectives. But it's then a job, once that's back online, I think, to kind of put yourself back together, like, I don't know, Humpty Dumpty or something. And overall, I think that psychotherapists are, at least in London, in England, they are better placed to offer serious, committed, long-term support than shamans, scientists, doctors, psychiatrists, nurses, or underground therapists. So that's sort of I don't know if that's controversial, but that's my claim, that psychotherapists are really well placed. And I wish there were more trainings and more information for people like me that are working with this on a daily basis. And I think that, back to your 10 years question, Eddie, I think that more of that will emerge over the coming years. Very briefly, my countdown is down to 2 minutes, and I'm not going to go over. Very briefly, my current research, I'm in the first year of my PhD. So I'm a bit jealous of Kerry being towards the end of hers, and even more jealous of Sam having completed his. It's early days for me, so watch this space. Please, if you want to keep up to date with it, then sign up to the mailing list at iresearch.com. It's basically, as Eddie said, it's at Birkbeck, University of London. I intend to look more at more experiences, look at more qualitative experiences, and analyze them scientifically using phenomenology as given to us by Husserl and Heidegger, via Merleau-Ponty and Sartre and others, to understand what people make of their experiences, sort of in their own terms. And then try and disseminate that, and try and it's them making sense of their experiences, and then me making sense of them making sense of it, and trying to, as I've done for you today, try and summarize that in a way that I can then communicate it and learn something from it. Because there's a funny paradox where almost what's most personal, most specific, seems to be, in a sense, most general. What my participants were talking about, going, yes, I really get that. In the same way, I don't know, you might share a song and go, yeah, I feel the same thing when I hear that song. So that's my current research. It's ongoing. I'm really interested in the philosophy of psychedelics and the philosophy of the science behind psychedelics. I think there are different epistemologies, different ways of knowing, different ways of looking into this. I think a lot of them are more compatible than we give them credit for. I'm sort of wary of a kind of one-track mind, whether that's the shamans in the Amazon that are kind of saying, no, it's spirits and it's demons and it's a kind of tends to be a language of fairly Christian, of good and evil and spirit attachments and things like that. That's the language they use to describe the experiences. And then the same on the neuropsychiatric side of endorphins and molecules and synapses and 5-HT-CoA receptors and things like that. I think that what I'm trying to do, or trying to encourage at least amongst all of us here meeting, is being bilingual or trilingual, and being able to talk about things using different language, and know that we're using different metaphors, and be a bit more, I don't know, creative with it, really. There are a couple of quotes in there. I'll perhaps draw to a close with a quote from Nietzsche. He said, "Do we really want to permit existence to be reduced to a mere exercise for a calculator and an indoor diversion for mathematicians?" Above all, one should not wish to divest existence of its rich ambiguity. That is a dictate of good taste, ladies and gentlemen, the taste of reverence for everything that lies beyond your horizon. So my basic view is that experience matters, that it's what matters that matters. And really, if plants are more than drugs and medicines and molecules, they're plants. And if people are more than brains or minds or bodies or possessors of well-being or spirits or souls, if you put people and plants together, you get psychedelic experiences with ayahuasca, and more than neurochemical events or spirit or demon visits. And that these experiences, this psychedelic experiences, what I'm researching directly, I'm trying to address that experience directly as an experience and then present it in its own terms. And I'll leave it there.
Awesome, thanks so much, Adam. You've already got quite a few really interesting questions.
Hey.
I'm going to use my prerogative and jump in first as well. Again, I was interested to draw a connection between those two parts there. So one of the points you identified in your research, I think, was becoming conscious of yourself. So one of your interviewees spoke about wanting to do ballet or running on the beach. And psychotherapeutically, I think this is quite interesting, thinking about the body. So in ayahuasca circles, it's not uncommon for people to have their first experience and it's cosmic and mind-blowing, and they see the face of God and they become one with the universe. And then on maybe your second, third, you don't get any of that. But what you do get is something that's going on just somatically, just internally. And to begin with, once you've reached those peaks and all of a sudden you've just got 6-7 hours of weird stuff going on in you, it stops being disappointing and you start realizing that actually there is some work that's going on there. So it's Bessel van der Volk, I think, who wrote The Body Keeps the Score. Like, I wonder if there's anything kind of unique or special to ayahuasca where there's some potential for therapeutic work being done there that actually isn't about cognitive, isn't about any question or answer in the normal way. It's just about what's going on in your body.
I suspect you're right, and I speak again. I think my personal experiences would echo what you're saying. A lot of people would talk about that. I guess I didn't bring it out as one of my themes, but the bodily sense of purging, of tensions being released. I sometimes think about, if our awareness, if our awareness is aware of 1%, if you think of Freud's pyramid, for instance, of 1% of what's really going on, at least in our own minds or perhaps in the universe, it's a limiting machine that kind of tunes itself to a specific frequency, and then there's all this other stuff going on. Then there is, I have exited ceremonies thinking, yeah, a lot of work's been done, but I'm barely aware of what it was, but I feel better.
Yeah.
So it's an intense full body experience. It's much less mind based or brain based, I think, ayahuasca. It's a heaving, breathing, full sweating, rolling around on the floor sort of experience. At least the way I do it is, and that that does lend it a certain, it's less kind of heady. I think that's right.
Awesome. So lots of representation from the Sams again. Sam Knott, I think you were first. Let me try and unmute you, Sam.
Hello?
Yeah, we've
Hi,
got
Sam.
you.
Okay, cool. Hi, guys. Yeah, so I think you kind of answered it at the end a bit when you were talking about kind of letting the experience speak for itself, but I'll pretty much just read my question. So you got the qualitative data where people are given their subjective accounts, but then it seems like your analysis itself is also qualitative, that you're kind of, interpreting and picking the information that you find most relevant or interesting or informative. So I'm kind of curious as to how you're sort of sure that you remain, how you balance out your own interpretation making with you got me.
Yeah, no, thanks, Sam. It's a great question, because my proposal is that this is a scientific method. So it's a good question because, well, is it? You're right that I'm a subjectivity researching someone else's subjectivity. The answer to your question, just the same as a quantitative scientist, I think would answer is, I have to evidence whatever it is I'm saying, and I have to be able to show that evidence. So if I claim that perspective is important to my participants, I need to be able to show it in the data. I need to be able to show coverage. I need to be able to have transparency over my data collection methods, and I have to be able to share it with other colleagues. You know, the kind of peer review process. It's not just well, I looked at the data and this is what I thought. It's about being well supervised, being in a team perhaps that are all looking at the same data and agreeing on what those things are. So yes, it's not even attempting to be objective, but it is attempting to be very carefully evidenced based on exactly what they've said. And I don't think I am looking for what I find most interesting in what they say. There's a danger of that for sure, but I'm guarding against that in the same way someone looking in a microscope might be guarding against it getting contaminated. What I'm actually doing is trying to represent as best I can. The first thing you do in phenomenology is sort of bracket yourself, say, let's take Adam's interests out of it for a minute. Let's try and be unbiased. What did this person say? What did they mean? How did they describe it? And that's why I'm using their words as well as mine. I suppose I use my words to talk about their words, but it has to be back to the things themselves. What did they say? Even if I found it boring, they still said it, and I would want to still include that in the results.
Yeah, thanks. I love this approach. It's great.
Oh, great. I've got believer.
All right, next up is Sam Gledhill. Sam, you're up.
Great, thank you. Hi, Adam. Thanks for that. I think I was probably a converted believer prior to your talk, but if I wasn't, I'm more so now. Quick question, actually it leads quite well from the previous question about the extent to which a psychotherapist might be involved with an individual's experience both prior to and after an ayahuasca ceremony. I've got sort of two questions in one, so I'll try and make it as quick as possible. I found somewhat anecdotally there seemed to be a bit of a split between indigenous shamanic retreats and retreats provided by, for lack of a better word, Western expats, and the indigenous retreats having less of a focus on support in integration and more of a focus on independent discovery and unpacking after. And I wondered if you could speak to what you think. So the integration process is believed to be very important and is quite heavily used in psilocybin trials in the West. And I'm wondering if you could speak to the importance of integration before and after ayahuasca ceremonies, how you think that may be done, should be done. And then secondly, possibly some recommendations for therapist communities where an individual might go to seek some integration therapy, a community of integrating therapists.
Yeah, well, just on that, the last one's the easiest to deal with. There's a few websites. There's one run in the UK by a colleague of mine, Mariah Papisparo, and there's psychedelic.support as well. I've forgotten what the name of the other one is. Someone will tell me in a moment, I'm sure, what the name of the, what's it called? The TRIP network, TRIPPP, I think, TRIP network. If you're looking for an integration for someone that helps with psychedelic integration. To your other points, which are a little bit more involved, yes, I think indigenous ceremonies do have less of an emphasis on integration in the Western mode. That might be, I would guess, and it's a guess, that when ayahuasca traditionally is done in indigenous settings, it's done within a community. So they're not like us who all live in our own little flats and don't talk to the neighbors, right? Speaking personally, they are not isolated to start with, and the ayahuasca religions have picked this up as well. You know, they'll be having weekly meetings, right? So in a sense, that's your integration process. It's baked in. It's your village, it's your community, it's your religious group, right? When a Westerner, a little isolated Westerner, takes a plane on their own to go to the Amazon and then takes a plane, comes back and finds themselves with their family and with their, and no one understands the process they've been through. You know, in that Ayahuasca, in the Shipibo communities, for instance, they'd all have done it themselves and know exactly what they were talking about. If they wanted to, you know, go wandering around the rivers for a few days because they just felt really out of it, they go, fine, don't worry about it. If you did that in England, that people look at you a bit strange, a bit of a weirdo. So that's when the psychotherapist kind of is the last person standing, in a sense, that offers a connection and an interest and their time and their presence to people in a way that a lot of those other ways that it might be provided have dropped away.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It seems so obvious now you say that. I would totally agree.
I missed a part of your question, Sam. Go on. What was the other part?
No, well, you answered it. It was more so that my experience was that integration was slightly less prevalent among indigenous groups providing Westerners with retreat experiences. But the answer you gave seems...
You also asked about the kind of how important integration is.
Yes, yeah. As compared perhaps to other substances that are used in a clinical setting and are then integrated with therapists after, like at King's, for example.
Yeah, I mean, my existential side is going to show itself here. It's entirely up to you. You know, if you feel no need to integrate, you know, fuck it, doesn't matter. You know, do what you want. You know, if you want it, do it. If you don't want it, don't do it. If you just want to go and have a good time, I don't have a problem with that. So I you know, different strokes for different folks. Some people need years of therapy after a single experience. Some people don't. Some people have other ways of doing it. Some people find immersion in nature therapeutic in a way they wouldn't find me therapeutic. And so you know, it's not for me to say. You know, I think that the professional integration options should expand, of course, but everybody's, you know, you've got to make up your own mind based on your own life and what you want out of it.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, that was an awesome question and answer. Thank you to both of you. Before I read out the last one to Adam, just if any of you have any burning questions that you want to ask to Sam or Kerry as well, to hurry up and type it in now. But finally for Adam is a great methodological one from Isaac. Isaac?
Hi. Well, thank you for everything that you've talked about so far. I'm just wondering, how does your phenomenological approach fit in with the quantitative work being done in other fields like neuroscience and psychiatry? And I'm really wondering, can you talk about your experience of conducting the research? Like, what is it like to actually to ask those questions? And I'm wondering, do they go hand in hand, the qualitative and the quantitative aspects of it? And I noticed here that Sam actually responded to this, talking about a study that he was part of with DMT, and that is just so fascinating. I'm wondering, you know, yeah, I'm just wondering about your experience conducting the research.
Yeah, well, certainly if Sam wants to pick up on that point, I'd be happy to give way. But for my part, yeah, so my current research is in association with colleagues at King's College London who are doing quantitative research. So for instance, they're doing a battery of questionnaires about the mystical experience questionnaire, the Beck's depression inventory, and a huge range of other, probably 6 or 7 different inventories, which kind of meet the quantitative side of things. But for instance, the way I see it working, at least, and I'm very excited to be working with them. They're great colleagues and friends, really, and I think that's essential to have that sort of working relationship. But I'm hoping to, for instance, if they have a scale that says how do you feel, like that thing that came up with one of the previous speakers about, are you an atheist anymore, sort of thing? Yeah, less so or more so. Say they say I'm less of an atheist, then I'd come in and say, what does atheism mean to you? What did you think before, and what do you think now? And what's the relationship between those two? Could you just say more about that? You know, what? So the questionnaire would use the word atheism, and then I'd say, but what does atheism mean? What does it mean to the people who are being asked that question in their own terms? You know, so this is about, you know, the qualia in qualitative research is about, quantitative research could could tell you, let's imagine that everybody that takes ayahuasca sees a load of red. What they mainly see is red things, right? I took a load of ayahuasca and I saw loads of red things. There's red everywhere. It's just red, red, red. Then I'd say, but what does red mean to you? What do you make of that? How do you think about that? What shade of red was it? Was it nearly orange? Was it more of a pink color? You know, and find out what people mean by it and what it means to them, and why seeing that red or that snake or that prince or that lion or that jaguar, whatever they might see, as dealt with by Ben and Shannon's Antipodes of the Mind mentioned before. You know, we can, rather than just enumerate these things, back to my Nietzsche quote about a calculator, sort of adding them up. It's like, okay, but what do we make of it? What do we mean? What does it mean by it? So that's my experience. To try and answer your question, Isaac, is that it's compatible. It's another language game. It's friendly. We can build on each other. My literature review will be sort of half quantitative, half qualitative, and I really think that they could amplify each other, and so that I can add I don't just want to add color to the quantitative research. I want to add new findings, answer different questions about how ayahuasca is working, I suppose. And I think that there's some questions that qualitative research is just better. As you said at one point, I think, you know, I'm using consciousness to address consciousness. So I'm not using computers to address consciousness. I'm not using charts. I'm not using magnetic machines to address consciousness. I'm using consciousness to address consciousness, which is exactly what Heidegger, you know, as his big move in the 1930s, said we need to do. It's like, if you're going to look at this unique thing, you need to do it from the perspective of the unique thing. Anything else, you're going to miss. You're going to miss the point, I suppose.
Awesome.
That answers it very nicely. Thank you.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Isaac.
All right, I think that concludes all the questions we've got. So thank you, Kerry, Sam and Adam, for joining us and speaking today. Thank you to the 40 of you who are still here. If you enjoyed the last 2.5 hours or so, we would be very grateful if you could sling a pound or two to the OPS coffers. Let's see, what do I want to show you? Right, just a reminder, we've got other stuff coming up over the next to the term. Another one of these symposiums with three speakers in 8th week. Chris Timmerman, who's been mentioned a few times, is coming to talk to us about DMT in week 6. And Benjamin Mudge will be our next speaker in week 5. So he's talking about Cambo. So if you've got any questions about burning frog poison into your skin, he's the person to ask. And on that note, I will bid you all good night. Thanks for coming.